and welcome to the latest episode of Film by Numbers from Outward Film Network. We are the film podcast in which the topic of discussion is dictated by the number of the episode. Thank you to those who listened to episode 0, Zero Budget Filmmaking, and episode 1, Film Firsts. In this episode, episode 2, we are discussing film sequels. What makes some work and others not work? How have they changed over time? Are they a thing of the past? Is timing key? Planned and unplanned sequels? Films you didn't know had sequels? And films that you didn't know were sequels. My name is Phil Slatter, and I'm joined by the one and only David Woods.
Hey Phil, pleasure to be here as always.
Now, there's an age-old debate about sequels that have surpassed the original film, which ones are better than the original. We're not going to tread that old ground, but Dave, what to you makes a good film sequel?
I like a sequel that expands an original world, and there's got to be something compelling about that world to make viewers want to return to it. And cynical exercises in franchising, like we've seen with the Saw films, they can ruin the impact of the original film and even cause the original to be denigrated unfairly. For me, I love the world of Alien, with Geiger's techno-physical designs creating this unsettling meld of flesh and mechanics. And the original Alien was so great because it preserved the mystery of the creature's origins. And this has admittedly been diluted by expansions of the canon, but there's still an inordinate amount of room to explore stories within this universe, and that's shown by the amount of media that it's generated, not just films, but books, board games, video games, and even the Predator franchise crossed over into the Alien universe.
Alien was a horror science fiction film,
yeah.
as known. And then Aliens, a lot of people cite it as being better than the original. I think, you can flip a coin. They're both superb films. But what I found most interesting about Aliens is it actually switches the genre. You've got a sci-fi horror on the first one, and then it changes. It's not a horror film. It's much more of a science fiction war film, which, as you say, really expands the universe, doesn't it?
Yeah, on a very basic level, people have talked about the switch from atmosphere to action with Alien and Aliens. And then you had Alien 3, which is kind of a chase movie, almost run like a heist movie. There's that sense of pursuit throughout it. So it's something, that does innovate a lot how it switches genres and quite effortlessly. And I think that's a tribute to the world created.
And I think that originally superhero films, you'd often find the sequels would be a bit more interesting because the first film was often about establishing the character. This is Superman, this is Spider-Man, this is Batman. And you'd have to spend almost half the film where you didn't have that titular character within it. And it would only be when they discovered who they wanted to be or their other side that you then almost tack on a story in the last third that would then build that character up into a sequel. And think
right,
like the Batman Begins, and then that became The Dark Knight and Sam Raimi's Spider-Man films as well. I don't know if that's necessarily the case anymore with Marvel and the way that they just keep repeating almost not necessarily the same thing. I don't think that's quite fair, but they've gone down this sort of meta-universe thing as well. So the days of having a origin story and then a second story that expands on that almost have disappeared a little bit. But then you have things like Indiana Jones and I would say Die Hard as well, that introduces us a character and then that character follows on the adventures in the sequel. So it's not a direct sort of remake or a direct follow-on of the story. It's a new story in the same universe.
You mentioned Indiana Jones and Die Hards. Those do create closed stories in a very well, I think for Indiana Jones, for example, George Lucas imagined it like the old Sunday serials. I think it was of around the 1950s. I could be wrong there. It's very much an emphasis on an adventure, and everything moves at pace.
I mean, Die Hard almost created its own genre, didn't it? We had Die Hard on a plane, which was Air Force One, and we had Die Hard on a bus, which was Speed, and then the Die Hard films themselves are sort of Die Hard in an airport, Die Hard in a city, all stemming from the original of Die Hard in a tower block in an office block.
It all comes from the idea of the ordinary person being put in an extraordinary situation, and that creates a great conflict from the off.
In some respects, though, they are to a degree repeating the same story to create the same magic. And I'm sort of thinking of family films that tend to do that, the likes of Paddington 2, Addams Family Values, Shrek 2, the Toy Story films. They almost do the same thing again to a point, but because the characters are likable, because the worlds are likable, they're worlds that you want to get into and spend time in. It doesn't always work, I would say. I would say something like Frozen 2 doesn't quite pull it off. The first one was quite special, and the second one didn't really expand anything that it needed to. But sometimes just repeating that formula, it can be a good thing.
Yeah, I think particularly with family films, kids films, kids obviously love being in that same world. They love something, they just want to see it again and again and again, and repetition lends itself to kids films in that way. You've caught something, it makes sense to give more of it. And I think in that sense, franchising does make a lot of sense when it comes to kids and family films. Toy Story's been able to build on that. I think that's quite an interesting idea that the family film benefits in a way from the sequel.
One film I think it's really interesting from this point of view is Peter Rabbit 2. The first one got quite a bad beating up by the critics. I thought it was a little unfair. I thought some reviews were a little harsh. I didn't think it was great. But the second one actually listened to those criticisms, and it didn't think, well, what did we do wrong last time? It actually said, well, let's actually make those criticisms a knowing joke within the sequel. And there's a joke about an American taking over this British story. And there's a joke about James Corden's voice being annoying. And it was really interesting to see them do that, and something that I'd not seen done before. And massive respect to the director, I think Will Gluckett is. He did a terrific job, was very open and honest about how he felt about the criticisms. And he even said he wrote down a scene where it was essentially just two characters reading out the criticisms of the first film within the context of Peter Rabbit 2, and then someone looked at the camera and said, I think someone's working through some stuff here. So that's quite an interesting approach and an original one as well. And then you've got something like Scream 2, which plays knowingly. How do you go from Peter Rabbit 2 to Scream 2? I don't know. But Scream 2 playing knowingly with the idea of sequels and openly saying sequels suck. And Mark Kermode makes the argument that he felt Scream did everything that it needed to do and you didn't need the sequels. And I see where he's coming from, but I think because we have slasher film sequels, Halloween, Friday the 13th, Nightmare on Elm Street, and so forth, the idea of doing another Scream film made perfect sense. And I thought Scream 2 really toyed with the idea and built on the idea very well. And of course, the rules of a sequel too.
Well, I think, I'm a big fan of the original Scream. What's interesting for me, I don't actually think it's that strong a trilogy, but I think I agree with you in that the way it very cleverly builds a trilogy on established slasher film traditions is really fascinating to watch.
And what do you think is it that makes a sequel? We're leaning into this now. What makes a sequel not work for you? I mean, is it just that we've said about the repeating of the formula, but so how that can work, but a lot of the time it doesn't, does it?
Well, I think actually you've summed up really well. Sequels that don't work are repetitious. We can think of the American Pie sequels, the Jurassic Park sequels. They're uniformly awful. And I would also say that changing the rules to an inordinate degree removes conflict and renders sequels unworkable. But yeah, I guess quite simply, sequels that try to stretch already thin plot lines and ideas are dull to watch and a waste of people's time. I think we'd all probably agree on that. But obviously familiarity is comforting. And we all have watched sequels in a franchise we enjoy because they're familiar, because we're comforted by them, we like the worlds, and then producers do keep making them, even if the sequels have diminished in quality. So I guess sequels really are the prime example of how film production is more business than art in that sense.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned about that losing of the conflict. We had that with the Pirates of the Caribbean film, which I think are very much a law of diminishing returns.
Very much so.
The problem is you kill off a character. We had this also with Kingsman. I haven't seen the second Kingsman or the new prequel, The King's Man. But as people have said, Colin Firth is killed in the first film. He's dead. There's no two ways about it. And yet he comes back in the second one. And the same with a lot of the characters in Pirates of the Caribbean. And you think, well, where is the conflict then? How am I supposed to really invest in these characters and care about what's going to happen to them if I know full well that you can just change the rules? Yeah, you can kill them off, but you can just bring them back. How am I going to invest in it? And that, I think, is quite a big mistake that a lot of sequels make. You also mentioned Jurassic Park, The Lost World suddenly tells us that there was a second island.
Yeah.
And you thought, well, hang on a minute. What about the first film where we literally saw a dinosaur being born on Jurassic Park on Isla Nublar? I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right. But then we get told there's a second one where they bred the dinosaurs originally. And you think, what? It just doesn't really make much sense. Similarly, The Matrix, we're talking about in films such as The Matrix and Kingsman, films that are quite recent, but The Matrix, at the end of the film, the whole point is that he is the one. That is the main goal that the film is leading to, and making him believe he is the one. But maybe he isn't. Maybe he's not the one. And you think, well, you just spent a film telling me he is, and now you're backtracking a little bit.
I actually do like The Matrix Reloaded, and I appreciate I'm one of the few people who do. But yeah, even where you've got an affection for a flawed sequel, you acknowledge it doesn't quite work.
And I think on the subject of films that repeat the same formula, we said they can work, as we've mentioned, with family films and adventures that people like. I mean, I thought that you mentioned American Pie. I thought American Pie 2 worked okay. I thought it was funny and enjoyable. But the first one, you're not a fan?
Not a fan.
We'll just touch on that then for a bit. The first American Pie just tapped into it was a very, very good idea. It was a nice mixture of silliness and seriousness. It was something that a lot of people could relate to, and it just worked. It just really hit the mark. I think I was about 15 when it came out, so it played to me brilliantly.
I'm serious about this. It was one of the best cinema trips I've ever been to. I went with some friends at university, and everyone was just laughing and having a great time, and the atmosphere was incredible.
I think the line "One time at band camp" and the flute, I don't think I've ever laughed harder in a cinema than at that line. You just don't see it coming, do you? I mean,
you don't.
Brilliantly delivered. But I mean, the sequel did sort of repeat that a little bit. I mean,
too much for me, which is why I'm
a bit too much.
Yeah, it just was too much for copy.
Back to the idea of repeating the same formula, I think with high concept first films, we've mentioned Die Hard. That's not really. I mean, it is high concept, but not in the same way as three films that I've picked out that really just to repeat it. You've got Home Alone 2, Hangover Part 2, and Speed 2. They're essentially remakes of the first one. And the problem is that the first films are all so high concept that you have to suspend your belief anyway. And then for the same thing to happen to the same characters again, you just think, well, this is... I went along with it because of various reasons, of course, but when it happens again to the same people, you just think, well, this is just ridiculous. And I think that is a major problem. I mean, the idea of Speed 2, the same person that was on this, and if you read the story of Speed as a real story, you think, well, that's ridiculous. in the news, where someone hijacked a bus and had to go above 50 miles an hour, and if it dropped below 50, it exploded and he wanted a ransom. Wow. Imagine then a year later, you read about the same person on that getting caught up in the same thing on a cruise ship in the Caribbean, and some of the same characters just happen to be there as well. Same with The Hangover 2 and Home Alone 2. They're so far-fetched because they are, to all intents and purposes, remakes of the first one. So you are doing exactly the same thing. What's the point of it? And I think that is a big question, isn't it?
Yeah, if you are just trying to make money, which I alluded to just before, you're just going to make the film in the same way as the original that caught the imagination of everybody. And, people are going to watch it. But like you say, it can be completely ridiculous and people go, well, that just doesn't work. And I suppose the lesson there is, please think about what you're doing before you make a sequel. Don't just look at the money.
Just one thing on Speed 2. I think my favourite moment in Speed 2 is when Jason Patrick in the middle of the Caribbean runs up to a guy on a jet ski and says, LAPD, I need to take this. And I thought, you're on holiday in the Caribbean, and you've just randomly gone up to someone and you've justified nicking their jet ski by saying LAPD.
Well, I never thought anyone would give me a reason to rewatch Speed 2, but thank you, Phil. I think you just have.
Of all it's a tiny little point, and it's not the most ridiculous thing in that film, but I remember watching that, just thinking, what? Is that how it works? That if you need a jet ski in the Caribbean, you just go up and just say, it doesn't show any credentials either.
That's what I've heard. It's how it works in real life.
Just say LAPD and off you go.
Look, I don't know about anybody else, but as long as I'm going to be promoting this fight myself, I want a lot more pressure put on for a rematch.
Hey, we can get the same money for the two top contenders. Why go after Balboa? Why?
Because there's still a lot of people out there that think he won. There's a lot of people out there accusing me of having the fight fixed, accusing me of being a fake and insulting my kids at school. That's why.
You want to hear the truth?
Yeah, I want to hear the truth.
The truth is that last time he was damn lucky. Now he's all finished. I mean, he's been hanging around doing nothing for 6 months. And any trainer worth anything wouldn't have nothing to do with him. Now I say, let's go after some new meat. Forget this bum.
Man, I won, but I didn't beat him.
I do like the Rocky saga.
Yeah,
I like the first film. But I don't really like the second one because I think it's just a remake of the first with a different ending.
But what's interesting is Rocky 3 is a lot better, and it's because it follows what all good sequels should do. And the Rocky franchise in general is quite a good example of this, in that it ups the stakes. There's more tension introduced. There's more conflict. Oh, this is a guy who is potentially wild and unpredictable. He doesn't play by the rules. Can Rocky really win this? He's willing to attack his family and his friends. Apollo Creed is a man of honor. It's a totally different kettle of fish.
But also the fact that he has to use his opponent, Apollo Creed, to help him as well. And he becomes a friend.
Very much so.
For 2 fights. And I just felt with Rocky 2 also, the thing I like about the Rocky films is they're not predictable. The final fight isn't predictable the first time you watch them necessarily. But with the second one, it is. It's like, well, he lost. He can't lose again, can he? And I didn't really see the point. But then it does lead into 3, which is good. I think 4 is very much become a cult classic. I don't think it got particularly great reviews, but I think it was the most successful sports film ever made at the box office until The Blind Side came along. That's one where, for my money, and this is perhaps not a popular opinion, they sort of made a bit of a misstep with the second one, but then corrected it moving forward.
Yeah, no, I'd say that's, I would agree with that. And I think it is a franchise that learns as it goes along, yeah. And
of course, there are some sequels that what they try and do is they try and recreate what I would call bottled lightning. And 2 examples I've picked out are Dirty Dancing 2, Havana Nights. And the first Dirty Dancing we know is an absolute classic. Perhaps not critically the most popular film ever made, but it's got a huge following. American Psycho 2. Have you ever seen American Psycho 2?
No, I'm relieved to say I haven't. And as I understand it, it was called something else completely, and it wasn't going to be. It wasn't even conceived as a sequel, but they just decided to rebrand it at the last minute, throw in a Patrick Bateman and introductory scene, and then just go with it, which I think sums up how bad it must be.
And it's again this idea of trying to trade out on another name. But just one film to sort of finish this point on, 10 Cloverfield Lane, which was a strange sequel to. I mean, Cloverfield was a found footage film that sort of had themes of 9/11 and a monster attacking New York, and I thought worked pretty well. And then 10 Cloverfield Lane could almost be its own standalone piece, but then they decided to bring it into the Cloverfield universe. And I almost felt that was the element that didn't work. And I think you probably agree with this, because the stuff with John Goodman in the basement is really good and really creepy. And then it just completely flips genre for the last 20 minutes, doesn't it?
Yeah, and I mean, it is almost a great world expansion of Cloverfield's. And I won't spoil what ruins it for anyone who hasn't seen it. But, I mean, the original Cloverfield isn't a particularly good film. It doesn't execute an intriguing enough concept to a satisfactory level. And what 10 Cloverfield Lane does try to do, and does nearly succeed in doing, is making something better from that material. But ultimately, that, like you say, that material let it down. And again, its potential that's not fulfilled. But that is actually a good argument for trying to make a sequel, is to coax out a good idea and improve on what was done before.
How have the sequels changed over time, do you think, Dave? I mean, are they a thing of the past? I mean, the old model, certainly in blockbusters, as we've discussed, was to make a film and then, if successful, make a sequel. I mean, it's seen as quite cynical because it was all about box office rather than whether there was another story. But nowadays we have Marvel making their own universes and TV series tying into that. And it's almost hard to know what a sequel is these days in some respects, isn't it?
I think it's still evident, as much as it ever was, and studios still look to cash in on popular success. I think what Marvel have done, as you mentioned earlier, is they've come along and opened up that idea of expanding universes across several films. So in that sense, they've effectively impacted the traditional franchising model. And Marvel do show us that linking characters in the same world and universes can unleash new opportunities for reinvigorating a sequel. However, it would be nice to see this done with more original and tensile material when it comes to mainstream cinema.
It's interesting, though, just back to the subject of the old model of sequels. The Bond films recently, I say recently, I mean, Casino Royale's, 15 years old now? It's been around, a long time. The Bond films never really had sequels. With the Daniel Craig Bonds, we had Casino Royale, and then for the first time, Quantum of Solace, which was a direct sequel. And then they sort of changed it up a little bit with Skyfall, and then the last two have followed the narrative through.
Oh, and they did a bit with Connery and Lazenby, did they, with On Her Majesty's Secret Service, then Diamonds Are Forever followed on from Bond's, the murder of Bond's wife, yeah.
But it wasn't a direct sequel with the same storyline and that picks up the same strand. So Bond almost inversed it, because it used to be this separate standalone adventures. There was a bit of continuity going on, whereas they've actually more recently decided to make direct sequels. But do you think nowadays sequels are always planned? Because I get the impression, and we've talked about films such as Home Alone, I get the impression that doesn't happen so much nowadays. They've always got an eye at least on a sequel. We saw it recently with It and Dune as well, Denis Villeneuve's Dune. They were muting about, are they going to do part 2? But it was all kind of hinging on whether the first one was successful. So they had the story there. It's just a question of whether it was going to be marketable. So is that model dead, and are they always planned? Is there always now an eye on there being a sequel?
I think that probably the cynical and honest truth is that if this film makes a bag of money, we'd like to repeat that.
But it's not always a bad thing if you've got the idea of a sequel.
No, definitely. I mean, you mentioned, it's totally. And you mentioned Denis Villeneuve's chosen Split Dune based on its box office. And it would have been a bit weird to have sort of half of the story released. But nonetheless, Dune's is a very long book, and it's also a complex one in terms of philosophy, religion, and culture. So you would, I think, in that case, have one eye on a sequel. And I suppose, just to maybe go off on a bit of a tangent, when filmmakers adapt books, they should maybe look at keeping the sequence model rather than standalone films, because books have so much more detail and insight. I could also say, in that breath, cinema can express thousands of words in a single image. They're entirely different disciplines. It's making them both work. But we've got this call going on to extend running times of films at the moment, which are noticeably lengthening anyway. And there's got to be a balance between authenticity of the message and sheer self-indulgence. And in all truth, in creating a closed story in a movie, not many films do justify being longer than 2.5 hours.
I suppose with the lines between film and television being so blurred these days, the idea of making an adaptation of a book into a big series is a lot more commonplace. I mean, I watched The Girl Before on BBC just before Christmas, and that's because I've read the book, and it was a 4-parter. But I mean, originally that was going to be just one film, and Ron Howard was going to direct it. But we do have this idea of splitting books a lot more now. Obviously, we had the Hobbit trilogy, which was, I think that was actually done for marketing purposes because they ran out of money.
Is that the only film that's actually longer than the book?
Well, yeah. I mean, and then they sort of justified it by saying about the they use all the appendix and all the extra bits and pieces. But even so, they really over-egged it. And I mean, I did like the Hobbit films, and I did enjoy being in the world. But I did feel that come the third one, the Battle of the Five Armies, I thought, well, okay, you really have run out of story.
Yeah, that's where I dropped out.
Really stretching it. We also see films splitting books of big sagas. Also with Hunger Games and Harry Potter, they decided to split the last two, just to sort of, maybe it's to try and wring a bit more money out of it, or is it to try and stick more closely to the original text? But they're kind of end franchises, really, as opposed to direct sequels. I mean, how many films do you think are made with no sequel in mind? I can't imagine there are many. But
yeah, maybe there's a sequel that comes as an afterthought in that point, which, well, that might point to poor timing on the filmmaker's part.
I mean, is timing key when it comes to a sequel? Because a lot of the time we can forget about the original film. I picked out 3 films which had quite big gaps in between the original and the sequel. Trainspotting 2, which I think we like. I say we. I liked it as a film. I think you liked it, but just it wasn't anything on the first one, but had some good ideas. But then there's the likes of Bad Santa 2 and Basic Instinct 2, which they came along a long time after the original film. And it was almost like, even if you liked those originals, did you really feel the need for a sequel? And had people not almost forgotten about them? And that can be a problem, can't it?
Yeah, I mean, actually, although I thought there were a couple of incredibly shot and designed scenes in Trainspotting 2, it felt unnecessary to me and just way too late. And I didn't really enjoy it, sadly. I loved the original Trainspotting. It is just one of the great British films. And for me, it just was everything that it needed to be. And it's one of those films that really didn't need a sequel. You love being in the world, but you like it just being there.
I think it was a film when we came out, we kind of thought, well, that was quite a good film. But then I think you made the point, you're going to, in 6 months or a year, you're going to forget it existed. And I thought, yeah, you're probably right with that. We will forget that there was a sequel to Trainspotting. And Trainspotting itself was more than just a film, wasn't it? It was a cultural moment.
It really was, yeah. With the soundtrack captured so many good songs in that era, and there was just a real urgent anger to it as well, which I think when you're growing up in the 90s and stuff, you really felt. So yeah, it was a real film of our generation, maybe.
Similarly with Basic Instinct, and people almost misremember the first film. It's not all about what you think it's about necessarily. There's more to it than with Basic Instinct. Obviously, it is a softcore thriller, but there's more to it than just the sex. And yet people say,
there is. There's Michael Douglas's knitwear sweater in the club.
Yes.
Yeah.
The best thing I heard about that, someone said this is a great indication about why you shouldn't take drugs. People go to a nightclub dressed like this. But those films that die out, not they die out, they stick around, but people don't. They're happy to revisit the original, but we don't really want a sequel. And I don't think that would necessarily be the case if they'd have made a sequel sooner with those films. But whether those sequels would have been any good, I don't know. I mean, another film that sort of goes against that was Wall Street 2, which isn't a great sequel, but there was a long time between the first and the second. But the timing of it certainly seemed relevant because the state of the financial world, and it felt like it was a good time to go back into Wall Street and visit the great characters of Gordon Gekko. Michael Douglas was still an intimidating screen presence. I think that in that regard, maybe that it was the right time for a sequel to Wall Street, but the film itself, I didn't really think did very much. I didn't.
I enjoyed the first Wall Street. It's got some exceptional dialogue and a great soundtrack, but never felt moved to watch the sequel because I still feel the original has a lot of relevance today. But I can see the justification for exploring capitalism as having the same bankrupt ethics shifted behind new marketing. So maybe, I haven't seen it, but maybe Wall Street 2 suggests marketing is the new corporate evil. It's a different message.
The new law of evolution in corporate America seems to be survival of the unfittest. Well, in my book, you either do it right or you get eliminated. In the last 7 deals that I've been involved with, there were 2.5 million stockholders who have made a pre-tax profit of $12 billion. Thank you. I am not a destroyer of companies. I am a liberator of them. The point is, ladies and gentlemen, that greed, for lack of a better word, is good.
There are, when we get into the idea of sequels, and some films we know have sequels and some sequels are very famous, but there are films that you didn't know were sequels. I mean, do you ever consider Silence of the Lambs as a sequel, even though technically it is?
Well, I didn't, because I wasn't aware of Manhunter at the time of seeing it. What a discovery that was, by the way. I love both films. There's definitely films I didn't know had sequels. I think of films like Starship Troopers and Tremors, and I love the original films of those. But they've got several cheap spin-offs, and there's actually an argument there where they've clearly been making these films because they're easy to make. They've got a ready audience. They're made for a straight home release market. And if there's kind of an acceptance there with B movies, because they can be a place of surprising experimentation for up and coming filmmakers and feed the lifeblood of the A-list movies. So you could say sequels have a lot of value to the exploitation market in that regard, the B movie market.
I mean, with Silence of the Lambs, it is very much a standalone piece, but you do have that continuation of the character of Hannibal Lecter. The
books existed there with Red Dragon first, which is a terrific novel.
I think it's the best Hannibal Lecter book.
Yeah, I mean, it's very interesting that they effectively made a sequel, but I don't know, promoted it as the original in itself.
Well, I don't think Manhunter was much of a success at the box office.
No, no, maybe not.
You do get introduced to Hannibal Lecter in The Silence of the Lambs.
Yes, yeah.
It's not like, oh, remember that guy who helped out or who didn't help out, who was involved with the Tooth Fairy? Him. Well, we'll bring him in again. So there's no reference to Manhunter there. So whether it's a sequel, it's almost a sequel just because of the book, but they're interchangeable, aren't they? So, you could quite easily have Silence of the Lambs without the first one, without Manhunter, without it making sense. And it still makes sense. I mean, there are films that you didn't know had sequels. I mean, I mentioned The Wicker Man, which is an interesting one because if you read the book Inside the Wicker Man, and that is on our reading list out on outwardfilmnetwork.com, there's an extensive reading list, and Inside the Wicker Man is on there. It's well worth checking out. There is talk of how there's actually the treatment for a sequel in that book, in which how he actually survives the final crucifixion. Also on our YouTube channel is an analysis of the final scene, which mentions this as well. And when you read that treatment, you think, well, actually, I'm quite glad you didn't make that film, because I don't think it would have worked.
It would have spoilt it, wouldn't it?
But then there is The Wicker Tree, which I think Robin Hardy said is a companion piece as opposed to a direct sequel.
Again, the idea of expanding what the sequel means. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, you mentioned some films that almost had we'll have to explain this to the younger listeners, but direct-to-video sequels like Starship Troopers 2, because the traditional release was obviously they'd come out in the cinema and then they'd come out on home entertainment, but then sometimes
now they'd be just down for streaming or downloads. That's kind of where they'd end up. Yeah.
Just doing some sort of research into this. I mean, Donnie Darko's got a sequel.
It does, yeah.
Called S. Darko. The Birds 2.
That was a good idea, wasn't it?
Yeah.
Who needed it?
Can't say I've seen it.
No, can't say I have either.
And The Sting 2 as well. I've not seen it. I love The Sting.
Yes, I am aware of it. Yeah, The Sting is a really great film, but I haven't seen the second. Again, The Sting felt perfect and didn't need any more. You absolutely could sequel it, but I never felt the need.
And just two films we have to mention in a very different genre. We had Knocked Up, and then This Is 40, which was billed as a sort of sequel because the reaction was that they liked these other characters as opposed to the main two in Knocked Up. So they made a sideways piece, which was more of a drama, really, and had some moments but didn't really work. But they both work as standalone films. You don't need one or the other. But that was just an interesting approach, that a film to do that. But the one other film that does have a number of sequels is Psycho. Now, have you ever seen the sequels to Psycho?
Never. I've only seen the original.
Yeah,
and again, didn't feel the need to carry on.
I'm the same, but Kim Newman, who's very much a horror guru, what he doesn't know about horror film isn't worth knowing. He's always championed the sequels, really. He's always said that he thinks that they're quite good. He's written positive reviews about them, and I'm sort of intrigued by them. I think based on that, I don't know whether you can't go into it and expect it to be better or more influential than Psycho, which is one of the great films of all time. But yeah, you can understand how there is a world to explore, because you've still got the Bates Motel and you've still got Norman Bates alive at the end of the first film and what happens to him. And I don't know, maybe I will delve into them one day. I'm not so sure.
Yeah, well, I delved into the Tremors franchise and watched Tremors 2, and wasn't great.
That's the thing.
But again, it's that weird thing. I love the world, and I wouldn't put myself past watching Tremors 3.
Another franchise we haven't discussed yet is we briefly discussed horror franchises, Friday the 13th, Nightmare on Elm Street, but Halloween's a funny one, isn't it? Because there were multiple Halloween films that I think in general, the general rule is law of diminishing returns. But then they turn around with the more recent Halloween, not Halloween Kills, but the one before that actually tapped into some interesting ideas, and it actually got rid of a lot of the stuff that came out in the sequels and had some good moments in it. So that was perhaps one where you get further. We're going beyond just the world of sequels. We're getting into sort of franchises and series now, but it was a kind of standout moment in that saga.
I think, with getting into the franchise territory you mentioned, I think they're all sequels to the original film, so that's a very valid point making there.
In some respect, yeah. So maybe that's because it is Halloween. Halloween is a sequel to Halloween, if that makes sense. I don't know why they do this. They've done it with Scream. They've just called it Scream. The Scream 5. They've just called it Scream again. And I think, why do they? Sure, that's going to get confusing.
Maybe they should have called it Scream again.
Yeah. I don't know. Don't know why they do that. It's going to be confusing, but maybe they're just trying to say, look, we're tapping back to the original as opposed to all these sequels that we've had. But we do like to end these podcasts with recommendations, 3 from each of us. And so obviously in this regard, we're going to be ending with a recommendation of sequels. Dave, what's your first choice for our listeners?
Well, I do like to try and think of, I like my picks to maybe be something that maybe isn't too obvious, so maybe just something a little different. So my first pick's going to be one of the sequels to Kinji Fukasaku, who directed Battle Royale, his series Battles Without Honor and Humanity, and they were part of an early mid-1970s 5-film Yakuza saga, also known as the Yakuza Papers in the West. And I was very close to picking the second film, Hiroshima Deathmatch, but I've gone for 1973's Proxy War. And that edged it because, actually, an interesting point about Proxy War is it's actually the first of 2 parts in a 5-part series itself. So it's the third film in a series. It's a sequel in that sense. And it's also the first film in a new series. So if that's not too confusing already. But it's the most dramatically complex, I think, of all 5 films, and very satisfying dramatically in that sense. Playing police against gangsters in this war of attrition, examining both sides of the law, which is what the great TV series The Wire did about 30 years later. And I think what makes Battles Without Honor and Humanity in general so brilliant, it captures a real sense of loss and displacement in Japan after the Second World War, and then this insatiable appetite for renewal during the economic boom of the 1960s. But given the age of these films, it's amazing how exciting and instant they remain. And I think the first 3 are the strongest entries, but the whole series celebrates intelligent, complex storytelling informed by the linking character of Shotsu Hirono, who's played by Bod Sagawara, and shows what you can really do with expanding a world. And to give you, kind of an idea of how it runs, they've often been referred to as Japan's answer to the Godfather films. But like Coppola's films, which are filmed in a very studied portraiture kind of style, the Yakuza Paper films were shot in this kinetic, fast-paced documentary style. So this was a really new kind of realism and ferocity to Japanese genre crime filmmaking at the time. And that would be my first pick, Proxy War.
So that was your first recommendation. I've got a very, very similar, really. I've gone for Toy Story 2.
Oh, so which they're pretty much identical films.
I've actually cheated a little bit. I've gone for Toy Story 2 and 3 because I felt the first Toy Story was groundbreaking in so many
sequels,
ways.
Phil, it's fine.
Yeah, that's fine. But I'm having 2 for the price of 1 here. Because as I said, the first Toy Story was groundbreaking in so many ways. But at its heart, it had a story with an emotional resonance of grown-up themes alongside many lovable characters. The second film builds beautifully on the ideas, and it gave more backstory to Woody, some superb in-jokes, and it somehow managed to raise the bar. And then the third came along and it raised the bar even further. And I think thematically it's the richest of the 3 films. It's about retirement. You've got characters like Mr. Pricklepants and Lotso, and not to mention the famous furnace scene. The moment is so clever because you watch that film and you know full well that the toys aren't going to get destroyed. But instead of making it this random escape or this frantic escape for them to get out of it, it makes this beautiful moment of friendship where they all just hold hands and they face their doom together. And then the actual escape that does come about, that you know is going to be there, you don't quite know how, is very clever and harks back to the aliens of the first film and the idea of the claw. And then with Toy Story 3, of course, there's the ending, which really caught me unawares the second time I watched it. The first time I saw the film in the cinema, I didn't have children of my own. And the second time I watched it with my daughter, and she got tearful because of Andy leaving the toys. And I started to resonate with the theme of your children growing up and leaving home. And I got emotional. So it was working really well on these two levels, which just shows just how clever Pixar can be when it does these adult and child themes. And people say it makes jokes for the kids and jokes for the adults, but it does emotional themes for both as well. Toy Story 4, I think, is fine. Do Kaboom and Forky are great additions, but the bar got so high with Toy Story 3 that it almost became impossible for the series to get any better. But the fact that the series started so well and improved so much was quite astounding. And I even said when the third one came out, that's the greatest film trilogy of all time because it's so consistent. I don't think you can find three films, even the first three Star Wars films or Back to the Future, anything like that. I don't think you can find three films that are as consistent as that. So my second recommendation is Toy Stories 2 and 3. What's your second recommendation, Dave?
So Roger Ebert, the late film critic, he in 2006 described my second pick as he wouldn't claim it's fun to watch, but if audiences still exist for movies like this and debate them afterward, the arguments afterward will be the real show. And my second pick is Lars von Trier's Mandalay, and I think this says a lot. I think it's one of von Trier's most challenging films. It's
sequel to Dogville.
It is indeed. Yeah. While it remains absorbing in a deeply uncomfortable way. But it's actually the second, as you say, it's the sequel to Dogville, which was made in 2003. And it's actually the second in Lars von Trier's self-proclaimed USA trilogy, which concluded with 2019's The House That Jack Built. But Mandalay shot in an identical fashion to Dogville on a sound stage with no physical sets, just chalk outlines, sound effects, the odd prop and the actors. And this gives it this very eerie, Spartan immediacy, which, given the themes of racial tension, is particularly palpable. It's set in 1933 Alabama, where these gangsters turn up and they find this plantation where slavery is still surviving as an institution. So it stars Lauren Bacall, who's the owner of the plantation, the late, great Lauren Bacall. And it also stars Danny Glover, who plays her foreman, Wilhelm. And it also stars Bryce Dallas Howard, who plays Grace, the gangster's daughter. She decides she's going to free everyone and she's going to liberate the slaves. And it's Wilhelm who resists and says, we're not ready for this responsibility. And it's such a challenging idea in that sense. I mean, as Ebert's referring to, I'm one of the audience members for this kind of film. And I love how von Trier really shows his fury against racism by satirizing, shall we say, the exclusion of black people from race debate by maybe this white guilt. And Mandalay also identifies a fundamental corruption of colonialism, which basically demands that there's a civilization, as it terms it, and creates the idea of the other, when what von Trier is saying, we're all people with complex thoughts and feelings, different ways of looking at the world. And Grace, this character who thinks she's totally right, is so selfish, because the debate is about a wider community and our society as a whole. And I think also von Trier has this really deep satire on how America is as guilty of colonialism as Britain, France, or Spain were. And as you can imagine from what I'm saying, it's a troubling, difficult film to watch, but it is never less than compelling, and certainly something that expands the idea of the sequel beyond what we can comfortably expect. And I think for that reason, it would be my second pick.
Now, my second choice is James Whale's Bride of Frankenstein. obviously a sequel to Frankenstein, which came out a bit before and is also well worth checking out. But Bride of Frankenstein, I think in many respects, you could argue it invented postmodernism, because right at the start, you've actually got Mary Shelley as a character introducing the story. And we know that the first James Whale Frankenstein isn't a faithful adaptation of the book. And interesting to see that there is going to be a story of Mary Shelley writing Frankenstein, I think, in the works at the moment. But I think that Bride of Frankenstein really develops the character a bit more of the monster. He becomes more sympathetic. He's sympathetic in the first film and misunderstood, but I think we get more of that, especially in that wonderful scene with the blind hobo, which it's quite an obvious metaphor, but you need to remember it was made in the 1930s. So subtlety wasn't necessarily part of the game back then. And the idea is that he can't see the monster, yet he's the only one who can truly see the monster for who he is and for the tortured soul that he has become. So it's got that element of postmodernism. It's got that a lot of religion in it, a lot of religious themes running through it. The monster's last meal of bread and wine with the hobo. And it's got that terrific ending where the monster actually understands better than anyone else. And I mentioned about religious themes as well. And we know that Frankenstein is the story of man playing God, but then the monster can be perceived in some respects as something of a Christ-like character. And I really, really love Bride of Frankenstein. It's not very long either. It's only 1 hour, 10 minutes. And just as a sort of almost a side note, but the ending where they create the bride is just brilliant. It's a real throwback to the sci-fi and horror of early cinema, with the big light bulbs and the lightning and the streaks and all this going on and the smoke going off. And it's quite melodramatic, but it's terrific fun. And that sort of stuff has almost become parody now. And if you were to make something like that today, it would perhaps be a lot more toned down and a lot more serious, because it's not meant to be silly, and it doesn't come across as silly or comical, but it's just good fun to see a director having fun and a production design team saying, right there, let's make this big, let's put this big light bulb in, let's put these big lightning streaks in, let's really go for it to really hammer home the point. And I just really enjoyed that scene. It was just not in a comical way. I can't stress that enough, but it could become, if you did it now, remade it in that respect, it would come across as comical because of the way that genre expectations have changed over time. But that's my second recommendation, James Whale's Bride of Frankenstein. Dave, what's your third one?
Yeah, those early Universal pictures are quite satisfying, aren't they? The monster classics.
The one good thing about Van Helsing, the Stephen Sommers Van Helsing, which was pretty terrible, is that Universal released a load of their original monster films on box set DVDs, and I purchased Frankenstein and Bride of Frankenstein in the lovely little box set, and it says Universal Home of the Monsters, and that was a long time ago. I've still got that to this day, and that was the DVD I dug out in research for this.
Brilliant.
So I'll always be thankful for Van Helsing for that. The 2 hours of money that I wasted going to see.
So my third pick is actually the sequel in an unofficial trilogy, but one that I think a lot of people will be familiar with. It won the Grand Prix at the 2004 Cannes Film Festival, and it was thematically linked to the other two films in the trilogy. And of course, it's Park Chan-wook's Old Boy from 2003. It followed Sympathy for Mr. Vengeance of 2002 and concluded with Lady Vengeance in 2005. And its linking theme is that desire for revenge when people are pushed too far. What do they do? And it also explores the effects of trauma. So they're notoriously difficult films to watch. They're challenging films because they don't apologize and they don't relent. Old Boy tells the story of a man who's been in prison for 15 years and then released with no explanation as to why he was confined and released. Then he's given 5 days to learn his captor's true identity and find out why he was imprisoned, or his new love interest will be killed. And it takes its cue from Sympathy for Mr. Vengeance. But what it does a little bit differently is it counters that lack of hope that there is quite palpably in Sympathy and Lady Vengeance with a sort of a manga vibe, a comic book vibe. You might particularly recall the famous action scene with the hammer, which is brilliantly filmed in one wide shot that also remains intriguingly claustrophobic. And why this is so brilliant is it makes Old Boy grimly amusing in parts, and it carries the central mystery through to its reveal by disarming the viewer from the horror of the truth. And you've got Park's astonishing camera movements, and it goes to details you don't expect. there's the constant sense in the cinematography of being boxed in, and in the production design, you can't get away from what's unfolding. And it makes it an elevation of Park's approach to sympathy and a spectacular viewing experience that just becomes a fervent cinematic memory for anyone who's ever seen it. And it's just a wonderful weave of a tapestry of ideas into expressive visual storytelling. And it deserves to be more than a cult classic. Maybe it deserves to be the classic that it is.
Excellent. I never realised that was a sequel. Never even thought of it as such. I've seen it, of course.
Unofficial, of course. But.
Yeah. Yeah. Thoroughly recommend Old Boy, not the Spike Lee remake.
Exactly.
The original. My third and final choice is Back to the Future 2. Now, I see the Back to the Future trilogy as almost one complete saga. It is one, but I don't really differentiate the individual films because of the way I came to them. I didn't go and see the first one and then the second one. By the time I was watching films, all three were there, and I sort of watched them back to back regularly. And we talk about sequels repeating the formula of the first film. And what Back to the Future 2 does is it goes back into the narrative of the first film from a new perspective, which is very, very original, very clever. It's almost European in its structure and its narrative. But before it does that, I mean, it's very much a three-part film. You've got the future, the alternate 1985, and then them going back to the 1955 adventure that they had before. But it has great fun going to the future. And I love how they worked to predict what the world may actually be like. They did research and they got many things right. It's what's fascinating. Multiple TV channels, drones, instant news, 3D movies, film series that go on and on and on, multiple sequels. You know, you think of what we're up to with Fast and the Furious now, 12. And yet Back to the Future 2, they have Jaws 19. And if you do get a chance, go onto YouTube and type in Jaws 19 trailer. They made it when there was a spoof trailer made by the filmmakers when Back to the Future, in 2015, when Back to the Future Back to the Future 2 was set. That's very, very funny and very, very clever. You got voice and thumbprint recognition, but interestingly, they still use fax machines because nobody had predicted the internet. Even in the late, the internet's kind of the biggest thing that sort of happened maybe in the past 100 years, you could argue, but nobody predicted that it was going to happen until the early 90s when it was here. And in Back to the Future 2, they got so much right, but they didn't see this thing coming. They still thought we'd use fax machines, which I find fascinating. So, side point, but talking about predicting the future, even in the alternate 1985, you have essentially a Donald Trump in power. And so predicted that, which happened in 2016. I know it wasn't part of the 2015 universe in Back to the Future 2, but nonetheless, it was very, very very astute. But it is its own standalone adventure, and part 3 standing on its own as well. And I love part 3, but the two do feed into one another well, and the story shifts focus from the character to Doc in that film. And there's the moment where they switch dialogue when Marty says "Great Scott" and Doc says, "I know this is heavy," because the focus is actually on Doc's character, which again is an example of filmmakers knowing what they're doing and realizing they've kind of exhausted the possibilities with Marty's character. They've told everything that they need to tell with him, so they shift the focus onto Doc, who was also very well liked. And it was a series that always stayed ahead of itself. They're not going to make any more, which is great. They're never going to remake them, which is terrific. And as I said, I see them as one complete adventure. You can tell that part 2 wasn't planned by the way that they write the character of Jennifer out of the adventures. They write her in, and they even admitted that if they knew they were going to make a sequel, they wouldn't have had her get into the DeLorean at the end of the first film, because then they just basically, she spends the rest of the saga asleep, doesn't she? They shift her around a bit. But nonetheless, Back to the Future 2, I think, really works well. I think you could argue it's probably the weakest of the 3, but I think it's still very, very strong. Great fun and very, very clever. And like I said, I just love the way it goes back into the first film from another perspective and plays with that idea. And you know what's going to happen there, but you don't know how this one's going to affect that one. And yet the two don't cross over. So if you go back and watch the first film, you don't watch it and think, well, hang on, in the second film, this character should be here and this character should be there. So that's very, very, very clever and really, really smart filmmaking from Zemeckis and Gale. So my third recommendation, Back to the Future 2.
Great.
Yeah. I think that brings us to the end of episode 2 of Film by Numbers. And we haven't even mentioned Star Wars.
I think we've done very well. Yeah.
Yeah.
But
we like Star Wars.
We do. And well, at least the original three.
Star Wars, yeah.
And well, it's out there. I think people know about it, don't they?
Yeah. And it comes into the discussion of Scream 2 when they say sequels that surpass the original. It says Empire Strikes Back. It says no, that doesn't count because it was part of a trilogy, so it was already planned. So, but nonetheless, still a sequel. And Empire Strikes Back, well worth watching. Star Wars 4, 5, and 6, 1, 2, 3, 7, 8, 9. Nah, don't bother. Generally. But anyway, that does bring us nicely to the end of episode 2 of Film by Numbers. Thank you very much for downloading. We hope you have enjoyed and are enjoying this series. We're going to continue. We're on Twitter, as I said, at Film Numbers Pod and at Outward FM. You can search Outward on Facebook, Instagram, and our YouTube channel. On our website is outwardfilmnetwork.com. We'd love to hear your feedback and any ideas you have for future episodes linked to Numbers. So do let us know if you've got any suggestions. Next up, it's episode 3. We've called that 3 Billboards Outside Ebbing, Missouri. And we are going to be discussing the work of the very, very talented and very, very much loved actor and producer Francis McDormand, who Dave and I are big fans of.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to that one.
Fargo, 3 Billboards, Coen Brothers, Nomadland, and the many other great films and roles that she's played. That's next up on Film by Numbers. Thanks for downloading and listening. We hope you've enjoyed. Take care of yourselves, and bye for now.
Thanks. See you soon.
Way too fast.